Hello folks, welcome back to our recorded lectures for HI121. This is the Mound Builders, the Mississippian culture. Now, I added this to the course because I felt it wasn't appropriate that we had no North American content in the course. So many of us grew up learning about the explorers that quote-unquote discovered North America, but not very much about the cultures that were here already. And Mesoamerica, of course, is fascinating, and you could have an entire course on it. The history department does, as a matter of fact. But this is my attempt to sort of cover an area that we had not previously covered before the last year or so in this course, and hopefully you will find it interesting. Now, we can't start directly with the Mississippian culture. We have to acknowledge that the Mississippi and Ohio River valleys were home to indigenous cultures that built mounds for roughly 2,000 years prior to Columbus. Scholars recognize three major cultural groups for whom this was a practice. It's important to emphasize that each of these groups could contain several related cultures within them. They're umbrella terms, basically. So you have the Adena, the Hopewell, and the Mississippian cultures, with the dates as follows there. To accept that should be 700 to 1500 CE, not 7,000. Yeah, that's a great blooper. I'm not going to restart and fix it though, so just please make a note of that. Culturally speaking, these groups could be quite different, but they did share the practice of crafting complex earthworks. The fact that they were able to produce these large mounds indicates that their elite classes were able to command resources. And men, because you have to shift a lot of earth manually. This is monumental architecture, even if it doesn't look the same way as the monumental architecture in the Old World. Now, their mounds could differ dramatically. They could be conical or flat-topped. They could be alone. They could be part of a larger complex. They could be squares, circles, octagons, hexagons, or shaped like animals. And I'll show you an example of that in a minute. There are many different potential uses for these mounds. They could be burial sites, they could be meeting places, they could be sites for rituals. What's interesting about these cultures is that in general, the woodland cultures were focused on their interactions with their neighbors. Their trade actually moved inwards, not towards the coast, and they had very extensive trading networks. They would draw in material from as far away as the Gulf Coast, eastern Canada, and Wyoming. The rivers were used as a means of transporting the goods, which is far easier than doing it overland. Now, Europeans did not see these cultures at their height. By the time of colonization, the Mississippian cultures were in decline, and it's not 100% clear as to why. Certainly, it was helped along by the introduction of Eurasian viruses and bacteria to which the locals had no immunity once the Europeans did arrive. Epidemics probably preceded the physical arrival of the Europeans in some of these areas, since diseases would have been carried along these trading networks. And we do believe that the impact on the population was likely catastrophic. All right, to give you a case study, let's talk about Serpent Mound. It's a rare type of mound. It's an effigy mound. It's built in the shape of a serpent with a curled tail eating an egg. It was first explored by an archaeologist in the late 19th century. Don't gasp, anyone. Nothing too terrible was done to it. Dating it has been difficult, though. At first, it was attributed to the Adena culture because of the presence of burial mounds nearby from that culture. But then radiocarbon dating suggested it was considerably later from the Fort Ancient culture, which was connected to the Mississippian culture, but not technically considered part of it. Then it was redated to 300 BCE, thus back in the Adena period again. It's just hard to be absolutely sure. So it is 1,300 feet long. It appears to be sort of draped over the area's natural promontory, as if the snake was draped over an altar. Over the years, it's attracted a great deal of pseudo-history and magical thinking. Various authors have attributed it to survivors of Atlantis, to the direct work of God, who used it to masquerade the location of the Garden of Eden. I could go on. Now, European investigation of the mound, as I said, started fairly early. Sorry, lost my place here. by some of the scholars of this of the early Smithsonian Institution. Ephraim George Squire and Hamilton Davis were trying to map all the known pre-European earthworks of the Midwest. They were the ones that were considered to have introduced it to the public, but it's likely it was known ahead of that by the locals. The previous archaeologists would have been late 18th century, not late 19th. My bad. Now, another traveler claimed to have visited the mound in 1832, so just ahead of Squire and Davis, and he says that he found a stone structure on top of the Serpent's Plateau, in front of its mouth, that it was an effigy of a tortoise with stones that seemed to have been heated. And he wrote in his memoirs that he thought he was looking at some sort of smelting furnace and pried it apart looking for gold, but there was none, so he left it there. Squire and Davis showed up and assumed that the stone structure had been destroyed by someone looking for gold. And they were correct. Now, 1883, Frederick Ward Putnam and 4 other archaeologists showed up at the mound. He had studied natural history and anthropology at Harvard. He was the head of the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology. And he published an article on the Serpent Mound in 1890 that popularized it. And he gave much more detailed illustrations that gave us a sense of the mound's scale. He did extensive research in the area, enough to prove there had been long-standing occupation of the area, including burial sites. He found clay platforms where they'd built fires to create a bed of ash. Multiple examples in the immediate area of this type of thing. So the Serpent Mound may not have been the only such mound in the area, but it survived because Putnam decided he was going to work to preserve it. He actually bought the land with the help of donations from people back in Boston. And the Peabody Museum would eventually return the park to the Ohio History Society. It's now the Serpent Mound State Memorial. It may have had astronomical significance. Jury's still out on that one. But what's interesting is that the mound was created in a geologically unusual spot. It was right near what's called a crypto-explosion feature. It's an area where the bedrock was fractured or deformed. Geologists think that these areas are created by impacts from asteroids or meteorites. In 2003, Ohio's Department of Natural Resources announced that geologists had confirmed that there had been a meteorite in this area at least 250 million years ago. So did the builders of the mound long ago notice something unusual about the area? Is it some reflection of what they perceived was something special about it? Now, a lot of the New Agers who are drawn to the site today claim that they get weird feelings when they're there around the mound. But even serious scholars like Putnam mention feeling a bit uneasy there after dark, which is kind of cool. There's a look at it from above. So you can see the coiled tail and the head up at the front. All right, so this is just going to be a quick run through of some of the examples that we have of evidence for extensive mound building and fortification in the Midwest prior to the European arrival. So David Zeisberg, who was a Moravian missionary who spent time in the Ohio River Valley in the 1770s and 1780s, described earthworks along the Muskingum River that were clearly man-made. David Jones was a Baptist pastor in Pennsylvania, discussed a mission into territory north of the Ohio River, where he found a wall that enclosed a square of roughly 15 acres. Each corner had an opening in the middle of its sides, had a spring inside surrounded by a trench. He was totally mystified by it. There's a letter in the Royal American Magazine in 1775 talking about a fort that the local Delaware and Shawnee couldn't explain and hadn't built themselves. It involved quite significant fortifications. And you also had a number of letters to Thomas Jefferson, who was very interested in the remains of the pre-European peoples of the area. So General Parsons, who had been stationed at a garrison in the interior, wrote a letter talking about finding artifacts and remnants of fortifications including conical mounds that were 70 or 80 feet tall that contained the bodies of the dead. John Cleves Sims from 1787 passed a letter on to Jefferson, talked about temples at Grave Creek and the remains of a town. Now, he suggested that the ancestors of those who lived in Mexico had lived there originally, that they'd been driven out by the, quote, more savage nations of the north. Couldn't be the locals who'd built it, right? Obviously, the locals didn't build fortifications, except that they did. They just hadn't done it recently. Now, Benjamin Smith Barton wrote a book in 1787 covering his observations in the same area, so Grave Creek and the Muskingum River. He obviously knew mounds were common, but that these were spectacular. He included a map of what he believed was an ancient town with 10-foot walls and openings at the sides and corners. Now, he believed they were built by ancient Danes, which is a little bit funny. Now, Jefferson is fascinated by all of this, and he really wants the American Philosophical Society to be the one to compile all these descriptions of the known Indian monuments and to be as exact as possible. So, as an example, a Major Jonathan Hart wrote to the Society and talked about the ancient remains he'd seen in the area. He did attribute them to the locals because he wasn't European, and he observed that this meant they had to have been at least semi-civilized to pull this off. It's rather forward-thinking for the 18th century. Now, by the time Jefferson becomes president of the Society, it had a committee to collect information about ancient remains and works of art, and he later tells Lewis and Clark to do the same thing. Now, the common usage term in that period was the word burial. So clearly they are focusing on graves and what graves can tell you. There seems to have been an understanding that these are connected to the dead. Jefferson himself carried out an excavation at one local mound that he called the Jefferson Barrow. He found bones, but he excavated them very carefully to look at the stratigraphy. And he concluded that the burials had happened over time, and they were not mass graves. There was no sign of war wounds. Again, it's kind of impressive for the period. All right, here's another case study, Grave Creek Mound. So this is a conical style burial mound. It's one of the largest in the U.S. It's 19 meters high, 73 meters in diameter. It's from the Adena period, created sometime within that range, and it would have involved moving 60,000 tons of dirt. The nearby town, by the way, is called Moundsville, after the mound. Now, the settler who claimed the land originally, Joseph Tomlinson, refused for quite some time to allow anyone to do more than a little bit of exploratory digging. Once it was established that it contained human skeletons, he put an end to it. But over time, the community wanted it to be explored in hopes of finding something exciting. So by 1830, Tomlinson's son was allowing proper excavation, and they tunneled to the top of the center of the mound at ground level, then created a shaft through the top to examine the mound's construction, the stratigraphy. And somehow he avoided being murdered by his mother while all of this was going on. Okay. What happened seems to have been that the mound was actually created atop an existing ridge. So there was sort of a structure within the structure, and they carried earth to the site and laid it down there. Now, the mound contained an oval burial lined with logs at the center of the mound. The roof was paved with stones, and there were two skeletons of elderly people buried with disc-shaped beads made from seashells. There's a second upper burial vault, much more in the way of grave goods, more beads, a shell necklace, copper bracelets, rectangles of mica, which might have been stashed together. This was not a mass grave with thousands of skeletons, after all. So the dig team created an observatory and ran tours through the tunnel. That didn't attract many tourists because the area is off the beaten path, even today. By 1860, there was actually a saloon atop the summit. Clearly, the whole tourist site thing didn't work out so well. It's near the local prison, and for a time in the early 20th century, the wardens were responsible for keeping the mound maintained. Apparently there had even been a gift shop owned by the prison for a time. All objects were created by the inmates. Today it's supervised by West Virginia's Division of Culture and History, and they opened a new archaeology center there in 2008. And modern archaeologists have determined that the mound's creation took over 100 years. It's rather like a cathedral. There's a better shot of it, and a shot through the window of the archaeology center. All right, so to reiterate, the Mississippians are not the only mound building culture, but they are the one that is responsible for some of the most spectacular examples. Their mounds were not only for burial purposes, but also as platforms for elite residences and temples. Most of them were built between 900 and 1600. The Mississippian culture saw major cultural change. First of all, they adopted corn as a dietary staple. Next, they developed powerful chiefdoms, possibly because they were able to store corn, possibly because their expansion also forced their neighbors to begin centralizing. Now, Mississippian chiefdoms were the first in the ancient South to include a hereditary transfer of power. So this means the chiefdoms do not dissolve at the chief's death because they were able to hold on to part of every harvest. So they hold a public trust to cushion their people against famine. There was likely religious connotations to this. The chief would be a representative of the principal deity. They were also likely able to hold on to their power because they were capable of commanding military allegiance. Now, giving the chief a share of the harvest was a way of ensuring against future crop failure. Military service and communal labor would maintain a settled foreign and domestic atmosphere and also provide spiritual gains. Now, I should also point out that the Mississippian culture thrived during what we sometimes call the medieval warm period. So this is a time of good weather and favorable climate between 900 and 1300 CE. So this meant that the Mississippian culture spread farther than you might have imagined it would, all the way into northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin. Now, they didn't just farm, they also gathered food, medicinal plants, fruits and nuts. Hickory nuts especially were important to their diet. They were boiled for their oil. They also had something called black drink, which was a caffeinated drink made from the leaves and twigs of the Yaupon holly plant, and it was used in ceremonial practices. They were also high-level fishermen. They used traps, weirs, spearfishing, and nets. They even poisoned fish in ponds with compounds that wouldn't affect the flesh. So they're a subsistence-level economy, but they're amply supplied, I would say. All right, so let's talk about Cahokia. So Breckinridge discovered, quote unquote, the pyramids at Cahokia in 1811. He compared them to giant haystacks. Now, he's not the first to find them. He discovered that a group of Trappist monks who had settled in the area had planted their kitchen garden on top of the largest of the mounds. He thought that the size of the mounds meant the population of the builders had been enormous, and that they were part of an empire, like civilizations in Mexico or South America. And he wrote a letter to Jefferson talking about how they must have been in contact with New Spain. But he doesn't attribute this building process to any non-American people. He wasn't fond of the local tribes, but he figured their ancestors had probably built it. He doesn't, not for a very complimentary reason, he didn't think that travelers from abroad would have been able to survive because the locals were so fierce. Now, those who wrote about the mound builders not long after him shifted back to the racist interpretation, however, and assumed that they had to be connected to the old world. So in this case, it ties into the American sense of manifest destiny. They had to find a way to look at these tribes as backwards, as being unworthy of the land that they occupied. Otherwise, how would the U.S. justify expanding westward? If they could say, oh, you guys destroyed a great civilization, so much the better, because it would justify, in their minds, harsh treatment of them. Now, one of the more unique theories came from John Clifford of Kentucky, who published some letters in the Western Review talking about why he thought the mound builders were, in fact, actual Indians, as in Hindus from India, who had somehow made the journey by sea. It was nonsense, frankly. He pointed to similarities in pots and, stuff that was just totally random. Now, one of the reasons these early accounts are actually valuable, even though their conclusions are frankly nonsensical, is that they often do take some time to describe the mounds as they saw them. And given that the sites have not always been properly preserved, that's very helpful to us. So, for example, we know that Cahokia at one point had more than 200 mounds within a 5 square kilometer zone. They were arranged around open plazas and surrounded by houses. But most of these mounds were leveled over time to make way for settlement and development. Starting in 1930 in particular, some of the largest Cahokian mounds were being flattened. So we will never have a full and complete picture of what this city was like. What we can know is that around 1050 there was some sort of big bang where social life changed dramatically. And all of a sudden you have this planned capital city of thousands of people. We may not understand ever what the change actually was. Was it a charismatic leader, some type of unification process, some type of religious movement? There is some indication that they were drawing on Mesoamerican models, similar pottery types, maize-based agriculture, religion focused on the sky and earth gods. There also appear to have been colonial outposts of Cahokia in southern Wisconsin, where they would have local copies of the Cahokian pyramids. All right, so talking about modern archaeology and what it makes of Cahokia. Preston Holder and Joyce Week, who were an archaeologist and a cultural anthropologist and married, were sent to investigate the mounds in the 1950s. Now, they were both very left-wing at a very difficult time to be left-wing in the States. Holder was eventually dismissed from Washington University because he was blacklisted. Interesting story about Holder, by the way. When he was serving in the military during World War I, he was a coast watcher on an island in the Pacific where there was a Japanese air base on the other side. And he convinced the local people who had practiced headhunting before the war to start back up again with the Japanese. Apparently, this demoralized the Japanese. And so when the Americans showed up, they were happy to surrender. Now, what Holder brought to Cahokia was an awareness that they needed to investigate the house outlines and the garbage deposits, not just the more spectacular mounds. So he sets the tone for ongoing excavation at Cahokia. And before he's dismissed, he and his wife have the opportunity to mentor their successor, who is Melvin Fowler of the Illinois State Museum. And Fowler had a much more serious threat than McCarthyism to deal with. President Eisenhower had just called for a new interstate highway system, and there were 5 new highways scheduled to pass through this area, which meant clearing land and leveling the terrain. Now, at this point, only a very small part of central Cahokia is state-owned, because one of the early archaeologists had done their best to try and buy up some of the land. So Fowler immediately kicks into salvage archaeology before the bulldozers can move in. They didn't have a lot of time, and obviously a lot was lost, but they did what they could. And Warren Whittree, who is one of these salvage archaeologists, was able to find some of the traces of what scholars called Old Cahokia, the village that had been dismantled to make way for the creation of the new city. Now, he also discovered a group burial where the corpses were wrapped in fabric and wearing seashell or beads necklaces. There were 3 women, an unborn fetus, 3 or 4 infants, and 2 adolescents. No men. So the question is, was this a ceremonial sacrifice of a competing lineage group? Mississippian bloodlines, we know, ran through the female line, so it makes sense. Possibly a new heir had eliminated the competition. And this sort of thing is also seen among the Maya. In 1967, there's a famous discovery at Mound 72. It's a small mound. It wasn't expected to be this interesting, but it contained large numbers of skeletons. And the way in which they were buried suggested they were killed deliberately, possibly as sacrifices. The contents of the mound dated to just after 1050. The main burials of this mound were spectacular. One of the two corpses at one end of the mound was under a 2-inch thick layer of 20,000 shell beads. They appear to have been originally sewn onto a cloak or cape that was 6 feet in length and in the shape of a falcon or a thunderbird. The other on top of him had been sewn into a shroud, and there were over 250 other skeletons and pits within the mounds. There's a lot of internal variation in how these different groups are buried within the mounds as well. There's something quite complex going on here. And the theory was that this was a ruler, and the ones that were killed or saved to go along with him, there were several that looked like they'd been dead for longer, and that their bodies had been saved in shrouds to be buried. They may have been important relatives or retainers. There's a lot of grave goods. All of the dead were buried in a way that oriented them towards the two men on the cape. It's very similar to Mesoamerican practices. Given the mounds all around it, it would seem that this was done in public, so there were no signs of walls. Was it a public act of sacrifice or commemoration? Now, there were similar burials in some of the mounds that had been destroyed over the years since the 19th century, but we only have scattered depictions of them that survive. There appear to have been between 10 to 16 mounds of this nature, one per generation of New Cahokia. Some scholars theorize that these mounds were created through what they call mortuary theater. So these are reincarnation rituals linked to the leadership class. But these are just theories. We don't know for sure. And that's where we're going to wrap for the day there. That was a very quick dip at the trough. I'm not sure I gave you as full a picture as I would have liked, but I didn't want to overload you with detail. I think we can take away that something very interesting was going on at Cahokia in particular just prior to colonization. We may not ever be sure what it is. Certainly it was probably not urban life as we know it from the Near East, for instance. That doesn't mean it's not worth looking at. Okay, thanks very much, guys.